From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Today we have taken action to pardon the Groveland Four. While this act cannot right the wrongs done to them many years ago, I hope that it will bring peace to their families and to their communities. I am confident that the people of Florida would not want this injustice to happen again.
Florida has pardoned 4 young African-American men in Groveland who were falsely accused 70 years ago of raping a 17-year-old white girl. Before going to trial, one of the men was hunted down and lynched by a mob of 1,000 men led by the local sheriff. Another was later shot and killed by the same sheriff. We'll speak to the daughters of one of the Groveland Four and Gilbert King, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America.
In a sense, it's the legislative branch of the Florida government recognizing that this was a gross miscarriage of justice and that there's a way to correct this and there's a way to move forward as a society by saying we no longer accept this kind of miscarriage of justice. If you look at this case throughout, it was basically what Justice Robert Jackson described as a menace to American society.
Then, as the longest U.S. government shutdown in history has entered its 24th day, the IRS has bowed to the wishes of the mortgage industry, reopening a key office to help the mortgage industry. Is this another sign of the Trump administration favoring the rich? We'll also look at how corporations and the wealthy have benefited from the ongoing gutting of the Internal Revenue Service. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The partial government shutdown, now the longest in U.S. history, is in its 24th day, with still no apparent end in sight. On Sunday, Republican South Carolina Senator and Trump ally Lindsey Graham told Fox News he thought Trump should temporarily reopen the government while pursuing negotiations with Democrats.
Before he pulls the plug on the legislative option, and I think we're almost there, I would urge him to open up the government for a short period of time, like 3 weeks, before he pulls the plug, see if we can get a deal. If we can at the end of 3 weeks, all bets are off, see if he can do it by himself through the emergency powers.
The comments came just 2 days after Senator Graham tweeted, "Mr. President, declare a national emergency now, build a wall now." President Trump has so far refused to consider any spending measures that do not include his $5.7 billion in border wall funding. Despite Trump's claims last week that Republican senators were unified on the shutdown, a number of senators have expressed support for reopening the government as 800,000 federal workers continue to either work without pay or are furloughed. On Friday, reports emerged that the White House may attempt to divert disaster relief funding, including money designated for ongoing hurricane relief work in Puerto Rico, if Trump calls a national emergency to build his border wall. This comes as the largest congressional delegation ever visited the island of Puerto Rico over the weekend to discuss the ongoing economic crisis and post-hurricane recovery. Meanwhile, despite being affected by the government shutdown, the Bureau of Land Management is holding public meetings in Alaska to push forward plans for new oil and gas leases in the Arctic. In Texas, the controversial Tornillo prison camp, which at one point jailed several thousand immigrant youth, closed on Friday after months of criticism from immigrant and human rights activists, Democratic lawmakers, and health professionals. This is activist Janie Stein responding to the news of the Tornillo shutdown.
Now that the children are gone, we've gotten confirmation from people inside and from politicians who have also been told that all the children are gone, mostly to sponsors, to family sponsors, and we're very happy about that. And we're also very concerned because we know that there are detention centers in other parts of the country.
Public teachers in Los Angeles are planning to stage a citywide strike today, demanding better pay, more funding for school support staff, smaller class sizes, and a cap on the number of charter schools in the district. The strike, initially planned for last week, was put on hold, but the teachers' union, United Teachers Los Angeles, and district leaders failed to reach an agreement in their ongoing negotiations. The union represents over 30,000 members. This will be the first such strike in nearly 30 years. On Friday, the New York Times reported counterintelligence agents began investigating Trump's 2017 firing of former FBI Director James Comey because of concerns he may be working, quote, on behalf of Russia, unquote, against U.S. interests. Investigators reportedly launched the investigation after Trump himself linked Comey's firing to the probe into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. On Saturday, The Washington Post reported Trump went to extraordinary lengths to keep details of his conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin hidden, including his July 2018 meeting in Helsinki, after which Trump reportedly took his own interpreter's notes. House Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler has said he's looking into the reports, while House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel said his panel will hold hearings on Trump's, quote, dark dealings with Putin. The Wall Street Journal is reporting the National Security Council asked the Pentagon about possible military options targeting Iran last year. The request followed a September strike by Iranian forces in Baghdad, which did not result in any damage or casualties. National Security Advisor John Bolton is known for his extremely hawkish foreign policy views and has openly called for regime change in Iran. Following the Pentagon's announcement of the start of U.S. troop withdrawals from Syria last week, Trump ratcheted up threats to Turkey over the issue of Syrian Kurds. Trump said in a tweet Sunday the U.S. would, quote, devastate Turkey economically if they hit Kurds. On Saturday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said he believed Turkey and the U.S. could work together towards a good outcome, days after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan blasted National Security Advisor John Bolton for saying Turkey should protect Syrian Kurdish fighters, a condition for U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Sunday Israeli forces had attacked Iranian weapons warehouses in Syria. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh today. The Trump administration's continued to defend the Saudi regime over the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed more than 100 days ago in October at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, by Saudi agents. In November, Pompeo told the Senate that despite CIA findings to the contrary, there's no direct evidence linking the Crown Prince with the murder. However, senators unanimously passed a resolution last month condemning Mohammed bin Salman for Khashoggi's murder. A Saudi teen who fled her abusive family has been granted asylum in Canada. Last week, 18-year-old Rahaf Mohammed Al-Qunum flew to Thailand, where she was first threatened with deportation but was eventually able to meet with UN representatives about her case. Her story went viral as she live-tweeted her ordeal, including barricading herself into her Thai hotel room to avoid being put on a plane back to her family. Al-Qunum, however, reportedly had to quit Twitter on Friday after receiving death threats. She arrived in Toronto on Saturday, greeted by Canada's foreign minister. In Gaza, Palestinians attended the funeral Saturday of a 44-year-old Palestinian woman killed by Israeli fire Friday during weekly protests near the separation barrier with Israel. Another 25 Palestinians were injured, according to Gaza health officials. Israeli forces have killed at least 220 Palestinians since protests under the banner of the Great March of Return started in March of last year. In more news from the occupied territories, a UN official has said around 27,000 Palestinians in the West Bank are no longer receiving any World Food Program assistance since the start of the year due to funding cuts. Another 165,000 in both Gaza and the West Bank are receiving a reduced number of food assistance from the UN-run program. The cuts are due to a drop in donations in recent years, most notably from the United States. In France, tens of thousands of yellow vest protesters took to the streets over the weekend for the 9th straight week, with over 200 arrests as clashes between protesters and police broke out in Paris and other cities. French President Emmanuel Macron has called for a national debate in an attempt to quell frustration among demonstrators who say Macron is too detached from the reality of working people in France. This is protester Marine Reynaud.
In the government, there are people who don't want to let go of anything. They've lived in it. It's their world. Fraud. Think of their own advantage. They have no reason to let go. They don't know better. And it's the same for us. We have no reason to let go. We don't know of anything else but misery. So we're best enemies.
In Poland, authorities arrested 2 men Friday on suspicion of espionage, including a sales director for Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei. Huawei is the world's second largest maker of smartphones. It announced Saturday it fired Wang Weizheng, who also previously worked for the Chinese consulate in Poland, saying he brought the company into disrepute. Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei and the daughter of the company's founder, is currently out on bail in Canada after being arrested last month, facing possible extradition to the United States over suspected violations of sanctions against Iran. In California, a federal judge has blocked an attempt by the Trump administration to weaken reproductive freedom and roll back parts of the Affordable Care Act by allowing employers to deny birth control coverage to female workers on moral or religious grounds. Judge Haywood Gilliam said the new Trump rules mean that states could, quote, face potentially dire public health and fiscal consequences. The court order, however, only applies to the 13 states and the District of Columbia, which brought the lawsuit. The new rules are set to go into effect around the country today. Iowa Congressmember Steve King continues to come under fire following his recent interview with the New York Times, in which he praised white supremacy while blasting congressional diversity. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said Sunday he would meet with King today to discuss his future in the Republican Party. In the interview, published last Thursday, Congressman King said, "White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive?" King also criticized the diversity of incoming Congress members, saying, quote, "You could look over there and think the Democratic Party is no country for white men." And 2 more high-profile Democrats have announced their bid for the 2020 presidential election. Julian Castro, former San Antonio mayor and housing secretary under President Obama, officially announced his run Saturday, 1 month after he launched a presidential exploratory committee. His first event as a presidential contender will be in Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, Hawaii Congressmember Tulsi Gabbard has also said she will run, with a formal announcement expected this week. The Iraq War veteran has come under scrutiny since the news broke, with some pointing to statements about LGBTQ rights early in her political career, including once referring to advocates of marriage equality as homosexual extremists. Her ties to the nationalist Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and the ruling BJP has also come under scrutiny. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Friday, Florida's governor, the Republican Ron DeSantis, granted posthumous pardons to 4 young African-American men accused of raping a white woman near Groveland, Florida, 70 years ago. The case is now seen as a racially charged miscarriage of justice, emblematic of the Jim Crow South. The men, known as the Groveland Four, were falsely accused of raping Norma Paget, a 17-year-old teenager who was white, in 1949. Before going to trial, one of the men, Ernest Thomas, was murdered by a mob of 1,000 men led by the local sheriff, Willis McCall. He was killed in a hail of gunfire. The other 3 men were tortured in jail until 2 of them gave false confessions. Charles Greenlee was sentenced to life. Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard were condemned to death. When Irvin and Shepard appealed their conviction, they were represented by Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP, who would later become the first African-American Supreme Court justice. But in 1951, Samuel Shepard was shot and killed by the same sheriff, Willis McCall. Walter Irvin was also shot by the sheriff and his deputy, but survived. Irvin eventually died in 1968, 2 years after being paroled. Charles Greenlee lived until 2012. But the story of the Groveland Four has continued to haunt the state of Florida. This is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis speaking on Friday.
Today we have taken action to pardon the Groveland Four. While this act cannot right the wrongs done to them many years ago, I hope that it will bring peace to their families and to their communities. I am confident that the people of Florida would not want this injustice to happen again.
Well, for more, we're joined right now by two guests. Gilbert King is the author of Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. The book was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2013. King is also the author of Beneath a Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice lost and found. And in Nashville, Tennessee, we're joined by Carol Greenlee, daughter of Charles Greenlee, one of the Groveland Four. Gilbert King, Carol Greenlee, welcome to Democracy Now! Carol, if you could begin by talking about the significance of Governor DeSantis's pardon of your father, Charles Greenlee.
Well, thank you for having me this morning. Governor DeSantis' decision was very, very significant to my family. Even though my father passed in 2012, it still lingered shame, a cloud over my family that he was convicted of this horrific crime. My nieces, my nephews, my brothers, my son, all carried this cloud over them. It has lifted that cloud from being carried by innocent children, innocent family members, and I feel that a chain has been broken. It felt like the door of justice swung open and the nightmare ended of torture, waking up in night to the pain of what had happened to my father. So it was very significant. It relieved a lot of pain, and it closed the door of injustice to my family.
Gilbert King, you wrote this Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Devil in the Grove, about the Groveland Four. Can you talk about what happened 70 years ago?
Right. 70 years ago, there was just a grave miscarriage of justice that took place. The accusations of sexual assault by a white woman in the Jim Crow South carried explosive consequences. And it was used by law enforcement at the time in the South to brutalize and control black people. And so the slightest accusations would lead down this road of within months, you'd see the defendants going to the electric chair. And that was going to be the situation in this particular case. As soon as Norma Paget made these accusations, within hours after those accusations, the Ku Klux Klan rolled into Groveland and started burning down black homes, chasing hundreds of people from their lives in Groveland. All of a sudden, you saw a manhunt. One suspected one of the members of the Groveland Four, who was not even in the area, was chased up into the swamp. He was a crowd of like 1,000 men surrounded him and basically riddled his body with bullets. There was no way they were going to bring him back alive. And so now you're down to the Groveland Three. They arrest 3 men.
And you're talking about the sheriff himself?
The same sheriff. He was in charge of the posse, and it was not seen as a law enforcement operation. It was more like a hunting operation. They knew he was up in the swamps, and they were not going to bring him back alive. And so that's how this whole case started. It was just sort of a housekeeping of African Americans that were deemed as troublemakers. Walter Irvin and Samuel Shepard were seen as troublemakers because they served in the military, and they continued to wear their military uniforms as a reminder to the people of the South that they fought and were willing to die for this country.
This is World War II.
Right, and this was seen as a very provocative act. It was seen as an uppity thing to do that, to remind the community in the Jim Crow South that, you know, you wanted better treatment. And so what a lot of people don't realize, in 1946, there was a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. African Americans were being lynched in their uniforms as sort of a reminder, saying you might have gotten more freedoms in Europe, but you're back in the South.
And of course, they served in segregated units in World War II.
Exactly. And so
known to have liberated a number of concentration camp survivors in their camps.
Right, and fought. Many of them were war heroes, and so, but it was still being forced back into this second-class citizenship when they returned, and you know, lynching was still a problem after World War II, and so this was a way of housekeeping. And you had a very law and order-minded sheriff who was very, very consistent, working with the Orange Grove owners, that he was going to control labor in this part of Central Florida. And by controlling labor, he often had to put his foot down on the neck of certain African Americans that he deemed as troublemakers.
And so talk about what happened to Carol Greenlee's father, Charles.
Well, Carol Greenlee's father, Charles, had come into Groveland expecting to be working as a picker and in the citrus business. And he arrived in Groveland. He didn't quite have a place to stay, so he slept his first night in a train station in Groveland. And he was picked up for loitering around midnight and taken into custody. He was actually documented in police custody for loitering at the same exact time that Norma Paget said that she was sexually assaulted by 4 men. He had an airtight alibi, but when it came to prosecution, all you needed was a state attorney to just ignore all that evidence and convince 12 white jurors that Charles Greenlee was one of the men who was involved in this. He had never met Norma Paget before, but he got swept into this too. And
so the sheriff was involved in the murder of 2 of the 4 men.
He was, right. And actually, he should have been involved in a 3rd murder. Walter Irvin, against all odds, survived that shooting on the side of the road in 1951 by playing dead. He was handcuffed. This was after the Supreme Court had overturned the verdict in the first trial. And then Sheriff Willis McCall said, fine, I have an idea. I'll go up and pick up the prisoners and bring them back for the retrial. And he put them in the car, handcuffed them, and started driving back to the courthouse. And then he made a little detour down a dirt road. And then he opened fire on 2 of the Groveland boys who were handcuffed, couldn't go anywhere. Sam Shepard was killed instantly. But Walter Irvin, handcuffed to his best friend, couldn't run. He was shot 2 times. And he's laying there in a ditch pretending to be dead while he hears the sheriff get on the radio saying, I got rid of him, get back here, calling his deputy back to the scene.
I wanted to turn to Henrietta Irvin, the sister of Walter Lee Irvin, one of the Groveland Four. Appearing in the documentary The Groveland Four, here she explains Walter's account of what happened the night he and Sam Shepard were shot in 1951 by Sheriff Willis McCall and a deputy.
When he opened the door for Sam, as Sam turned to get out of the car, Walter Lee said he shot him right in his forehead. Just like that. He said he shot him so fast and he felt his weight moving until he knew that Sam was dead. He said, but by that time, he had done shot him also. And he said he remembered hearing him say, come on back, I have killed the son of a... He said, but when Mr. Yates got back and he was shining his light on him, he kicked Sam and he shined the light on him and said, but this is not dead. And he said he pulled out his gun and he aimed right at his head. And it went in the neck. And he said that time he was out. He tried to pretend like he was dead so that they wouldn't, kill him. But he still was alive.
Wow. So that's Henrietta Irvin, the sister of Walter Lee Irvin, shot by the sheriff. And then the deputy comes back, says he's still alive, and shoots him again as he lay in the ditch.
Right. And what's amazing, if Walter Irvin had died right there, that would have been the end of this story. I would not have written this book. Nobody would know about this case, because now it became the word of law enforcement. But because Walter Irvin survived, he told a story of how he received that last bullet. And so when he said that he was shot at near point-blank range and that bullet went right through his neck, the FBI went back to the scene of the crime. They found the blood spot where Walter Irvin was laying, and they dug under that blood spot, and they found a .38 caliber bullet that matched a Smith & Wesson gun. So now the FBI had pure proof of cold-blooded murder. I think probably the most disturbing part of this entire story was that entire investigation was quashed by the FBI. The FBI recommended that the sheriff and the deputy be prosecuted, and it was quashed by the U.S. attorney. And so when I filed the Freedom of Information Act request 60 years later, I was the first person to see that report, the forensic report. Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers never knew about it.
I wanted to go to the comments of Norma Padgett. Norma Padgett is now she is 86 years old. She testified in front of the Florida Clemency Board on Friday. This is the first time she has spoken publicly since 1952.
My name is Norma Tyson Padgett Upshaw, and I'm the victim of that night. And I'll tell you now that it's on my mind. It's been on my mind for about 70 years. I was 17 years old, and it's never left my mind. And I can tell you from the time it started until today. If it was last night, I could carry you on that route that I went that night. And I'll tell you this. If you had a gun held to your head and told you if you screamed and didn't do what they said, that they'd blow your brains out, so what would you do? And if you had a daughter, and if you and a mother, and a wife, and a sister, or a niece, and would you give them pardon? No, I don't think you would. I really don't. And every time it comes up, I just quiver on the inside.
That's Norma Padgett, now 86 years old, testifying in front of the Florida Clemency Board. Carol Greenlee, your response to what Norma Padgett said?
My response was that this is a free country, it's for freedom of speech, and I just felt numb at the time. I believe that she said what she felt, and it didn't change my mind at all after years of reading the testimonies and the investigation reports and the books that have been written by individuals digging out the truth. So it really didn't cause me any ill will against Mrs. Padgett.
Gilbert King, what do we know about what happened to Norma Padgett?
Well, one of the interesting things that happened is that Norma Padgett was out. She had already separated from her husband. She was 17 years old, and there were rumors around town that he was already beating her and that the family sort of forced a separation. So in the summer of 1949, they got back together one night and went out drinking and dancing. And we don't know exactly what happened on the side of that road that night, but we do know that two men, Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard, came by and helped them with a broken car on the side of the road. And at one point, Willie Padgett, Norma's husband, made a racial remark about these African Americans because Norma had offered them a drink of whiskey. And he made a racial remark, and Sam Shepard sort of fought with him, and then they drove off. To sort of put a story in place, Willie Padgett said, there were 4 of them that beat me up, and then they abducted and raped my wife. And they started this whole story, and that was what led to the whole reaction in the community.
It was believed it was her husband that beat her?
Yeah, that was what the defense certainly believed, that the story was put in place by the husband. He was the first one to start it and said, Norma, you gotta say that 4 black men did this and they took you away.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion with Gilbert King, author of Devil in the Grove, and Carol Greenlee, daughter of Charles Greenlee, one of the Groveland 4, who were just posthumously pardoned by the Florida governor on Friday. Stay with us.
March down Freedom Highway. Oh yeah, marching each and every day. March down Freedom Highway. Oh yeah, marching each and every day. Made up my mind that I won't turn around. Made up my mind that I won't turn around. There's just one thing I can't understand, my friend. Why some folks think freedom is not designed for all men.
Freedom Highway by Rhiannon Giddens. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Friday, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis granted posthumous pardons to 4 young African-American men accused of raping a white woman near Groveland, Florida in 1949, 70 years ago. The case now seen as a racist miscarriage of justice emblematic of the Jim Crow South. This is Henrietta Irvin, a sister of Walter Irvin, one of the Groveland Four. She spoke to the Orlando Sentinel about visiting her brother on death row.
I remember going to Rayford the Sunday before he was supposed to be electrocuted. That was terrible. His head was shaved. And they was talking to us about what was going to happen, and we needed to be to Rayford to pick his body up, or otherwise they would just bury him in a grave. But it didn't work like that.
Again, that was Walter Irvin's sister. Walter Irvin received a last-minute stay that saved his life. He was later paroled in 1968. Still with us, Gilbert King, author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. And in Nashville, Tennessee, we're joined by Carol Greenlee, the daughter of Charles Greenlee, one of the Groveland Four. Carol, can you talk about your life, what it meant that your father was imprisoned for what? He was imprisoned for about 10 years?
Yes, he was in prison in Rayford, Florida for 10 years. I can remember the first seeing him. I was about 3 years old when my mother would take me to the prison, and on a Sunday for visits. And the last time that I saw my father in prison, I was about 3, and he said to my mother not to bring me back anymore because it was just too hard. As a 3-year-old child, I can remember thinking, you know, what did I do wrong? And am I the reason for my father to be here? The guilt that plagued me for years throughout my young life. It was hard. It was the shame in when conversations with your peers centered around activities that they've done with their families, including their father. I found myself politely leaving the area, leaving the room, so that I wouldn't have to talk about it. So it was a time of hard, painful excuses for me, and trying to understand why this happened. But all during this time, my father would send me gifts wrapped in brown paper bags, if you will, a card on birthdays, a card on a holiday. He seems to have gathered from in the prison. I remember one of the last things he sent me was a jewelry box made of match stem, burnt match stems that I have today. It was a time that I felt that I had been doing time with my father. because I could not express what I thought that I needed to in terms of activities or going different places with my father. So I spent those 10 years also locked up in prison within myself, a sense of shame, guilt that I was responsible because I was the one that he actually went to Groveland seeking a job. I was the unborn child at that time that he was trying to find a job to take care of. So I carried that as my burden of guilt.
Gilbert King, I wanted to ask you, there is a lot of attention on the U.S. Supreme Court today. You've written extensively also about the Supreme Court. But, you know, the subtitle of your book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New Era. This is before Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Talk about his taking on this case and how dangerous it was.
Oh, it was extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, when I first came across this case, I found these letters from the young lawyers in Florida, and they were basically imploring Thurgood Marshall to send help. They needed the FBI, they needed protection, that Florida was the most dangerous place they'd ever come across as lawyers. And I remember thinking, what is happening in Florida? And that's how I learned about this case. It was a deadly case. They had to move the lawyers and Thurgood Marshall around from house to house each night because the Klan was after them. They were threatening them. They were chasing them after court dates. And so it was a very dangerous place for young black lawyers to be practicing law. I think one of the things that was most striking to me, and it's really started in the beginning of the trial when you had Norma Paget 70 years ago showed up in courtroom, and she stood up in the witness box and she identified 3 of the Groveland boys as her attackers. And the lawyers and the press that were watching this, they basically said, this trial is now over. That was enough. You didn't need any more evidence. It was the word of this young white woman accusing black men of rape that was going to lead to the electric chair. And the power of those words, I thought, was so significant to Marshall because even he knew it was over. 70 years later, Norma Paget came into the hearing room in Tallahassee to testify before the Clemency Board. She had not spoken to anyone publicly in 70 years. And I think it was interesting to see what had happened in those 70 years. Her words were no longer enough to ensure that these men were going to die for that accusation. Now it became evidence-based, and I think that's what you saw. The Clemency Board now had their hands on all of this evidence that was hidden from the defense at the time. The medical report in this particular case, a doctor examined Norma Paget hours after this alleged attack and found no evidence of any kind of attack. What did the prosecutor do in this case? They hid that witness. When Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers tried to subpoena that medical report, it was quashed, and the U.S. attorney said that's a private matter between a woman and her doctor. This was evidence that was possibly exculpatory, and it was all hidden. The amount of perjury that existed and prosecutorial misconduct, it was a different criminal justice world.
Talk about what you found in writing Devil in the Grove. By the way, how many publishers turned down the publication of this book before you got one who would take it?
Yeah, this was rejected 38 times by publishers.
So you got a publisher, and then even when it was published, you got a message from them soon after saying they're going to remainder it because no one's interested.
Right. It was just one of those things. I think at the time in 2012, people weren't really into these kind of justice stories, and it didn't really get a lot of attention, didn't get a lot of reviews. And
the day after you got that call from the publisher or that they were going to remainder your book?
Got the Pulitzer Prize. So it was a totally different book all of a sudden one day later, and now people were paying attention.
And talk about what you uncovered, what you were able to find.
Well, I think the main thing that I was able to uncover was that I got my hands on the unredacted FBI reports. And so those were significant because you had law enforcement agents admitting to torturing the Groveland boys in the basement, even though their official statement said that they must have gotten in a fight before I arrested them. You had constant law enforcement believing they were going off the record to the FBI and saying that this did not happen and that these witnesses are lying. And I just found a ton of perjury. Even Norma Paget's own statements that she made to the FBI did not match the testimony that she gave in the trial. So that was changed in order to present this prosecutorial narrative. So there was just perjury, falsification of evidence. The police went about and made fake footprints in the soil to put these men in there, and that was documented by an FBI expert. But all of this evidence was ignored because the prosecutor was on a first-name basis with 12 white jurors.
The role of Mabel Norris Reese, you write about her in Devil in the Grove, but also your new book, Beneath a Ruthless Sun, A True Story of Violence, Race, and Justice, Lost and Found.
Right. Well, I think it was really important to see how this case was covered. And Mabel Norris Reese was one of the reporters who was writing about this Groveland case. And ultimately, when the Supreme Court overturned the decision in Lake County, they pointed to the bias in the press. And Mabel was one of them. And she later admitted that she deserved to be stepped on because she was taking the sheriff's word for everything. And after the shooting on the side of the road, she had a real change of heart. And she was determined to report on this sheriff and the injustices.
Murdering one and critically wounding the other of the Groveland Four.
I think that's when Mabel really knew that this was really a really bad sheriff. And so she started writing about him constantly. And years later, they burned down her home. They burned a cross. They defaced her office, poisoned her dog. Ultimately, they ran her out of town because she was reporting on these kind of stories. And my latest book is 10 years later, after Groveland. There's another explosive rape case that reaches the U.S. Supreme Court. And sure enough, Willis McCall's in charge of the investigation. And it's only Mabel Norris Reese, the only one who will write about it.
And Thurgood Marshall went from investigating the case. Was he on the Supreme Court at the time that it was considered?
He was, and it's interesting because at some point in Beneath a Ruthless Sun, when this story when this case reaches the U.S. Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall is on there, and he knows all about Lake County and Willis McCall. And so they sent an order to show cause back to Lake County explaining why they're holding this young man in an asylum.
Not to confuse the two, but in Beneath the Ruthless Sun, the young man you're talking about was a white, mentally disabled man.
Right, and that's really the strange twist in this. Because it involved a wealthier family this time, it was an actual real rape in this particular case. But because it was seen as so impolite, the prosecutor got together with the sheriff and the judge, and they decided to switch the race of the defendant so that the victim's husband would not bear the shame of having been assaulted by an African American. And so they framed a white man of rape at the time.
So going back to this case, a pardon isn't total exoneration. Can you explain that, Gilbert King? And what is there any further developments? Will these men ever be fully exonerated?
Yeah, they will. And the reason a pardon sort of encompasses all of it. It's a recognition that there was a miscarriage of justice. And the reason it was done was because two of the men of the Groveland Four were never convicted in a court. Ernest Thomas never stood trial. He was gunned down by the posse. And Sam Shepard was gunned down on the evening of the retrial. So technically his conviction was thrown out. This was a way for the Clemency Board to acknowledge all four Groveland boys, pardon them. Right now, the FDLE, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, is working with the Attorney General's office. I'm working with them, too, getting together all these files and reports. And the very next step is going to be a complete exoneration. And that just takes a little bit longer to write that report.
Carol Greenlee, if your father were alive today, he died back in 2012, what would you say to him? And what would this total exoneration mean to you?
It would mean everything in terms of how our family view Florida. It would how our family really view the criminal justice system in this United States. It restores faith and hope that even though it took 70 years. It's here. It finally happened. And the same system that tortured him, that put him in prison for what they did not do, is the same system that would exonerate him. So yes, you have to maintain hope, and this is the greatest country in the world.
And finally, what does the story of what happened to your father say to you about the criminal justice system today, looking at what you see today when it comes to criminal justice and African Americans?
That things have changed, but we still have a long way to go. And it is the laws, the rule of law on the books are good, but we as people have to enforce them in the right way. I'm pretty sure that back in 1949, the law was to make sure that everybody had a fair trial. It wasn't the law, it was the people that was administering the law, and we still have that today. But thank God things are changing. We have the ability for people to stand up and be bold and tell the truth. Governor DeSantis and all of the elected officials in Florida felt that, have done that. They used the law to rectify a wrong, and I'm thankful for that.
And Gilbert King, finally, as we look at the health of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, the announcement Friday that she is cancer-free, she's just recuperating, and even as the court continues to hear oral arguments, she is looking at the transcripts and being a part of the decision-making expected back in February. The legacy of Thurgood Marshall on the court and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her significance.
Right. Well, I think it's an extremely worrisome way to look at what's happening in America. You know, we go back to Brown versus Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall's great desegregation of the schools case.
And that case, 1955, was 6 years after the Groveland case.
Right.
Actually, just a few years after, because it took a few years to go to court.
Exactly. And what a lot of people don't realize is Brown versus Board was funded on the back of this criminal case. All of the money that was raised for the Groveland case got pushed right over into Brown versus Board, which enabled them to put together this phenomenal civil rights document to bring that case forward. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is after Brown versus Board, which is the landmark civil rights decision in all of the Supreme Court in the 20th century, the country took a step backwards, and you started to see more racial violence and tension. You saw the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. You saw the white citizens councils popping up, 300,000 members in 11 states. Race relations went backwards after that, and I think that's a pattern that you see in history. You could look at it and say, African-American President Barack Obama serves 8 years, wins those elections quite comfortably, and there is something of a backlash that you see, a reaction to that. But I like to think it's like it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's a cycle that will always repeat itself in history. But, as Martin Luther King said about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, I think that's ultimately where you get. It's always moving forward. And, the situation with the Supreme Court makeup, it's concerning. When you have an attorney general who comes in and appointed by a president who is really not known for his civil rights point of view, it's definitely concerning. But I do have hope for the future.
Gilbert King, author of Devil in the Grove. This is the story of the Groveland Four, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. His latest book, Beneath the Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice, lost and found. And thanks so much to Carol Greenlee, daughter of Charles Greenlee, one of the Groveland Four, again pardoned by Florida's governor on Friday. This is Democracy Now! As the government shutdown continues, we look at the IRS, what it is and isn't doing, and its history, how it's been gutted over the last decade. Stay with us.
Stop paying taxes. Now what if we all
Stop Paying Taxes by Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The partial government shutdown, now the longest in U.S. history, has dragged into its 24th day with still no apparent end in sight, as 800,000 federal workers remain furloughed or working without pay, with some unable to make rent or pay medical bills. We end today's show looking at how the Trump administration's restarted a division of the Internal Revenue Service to help the corporate lenders, the mortgage industry. The Washington Post reports an appeal from the mortgage industry has resulted in hundreds of paid IRS staffers returning to the agency to carry out income verifications for the mortgage industry. This process earns the $1.3 trillion mortgage banking industry millions of dollars in fees. According to the Washington Post, the IRS workers were called back to work just one day after a trade association representing credit reporting companies and high-level officials in the mortgage industry lobbied top advisors to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. Robert Brooksmith, chief executive of the Mortgage Bankers Association, wrote to Mnuchin's senior advisor, Craig Phillips, "Could you make these guys essential?" Unlike the 420,000 workers forced to work without pay, the 400 IRS workers called back to work are being paid using industry user fees. Marvin Friedlander, a former senior IRS official, told the Washington Post, "It seems crazy to me that a powerful banker lobby gets to bring their people back to do their work. How about the normal slob who can't even pay his rent?" he asked. For more, we're joined by Paul Keel, reporter for ProPublica, one of the contributors to the remarkable series, Gutting the IRS, a multi-year campaign to slash the IRS budget, has left it understaffed and on the defensive. That's been good news for the tax cheats, the rich, and big corporations, but not for the poor. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Paul. So first, talk about making this group of workers essential and bringing them back to serve the mortgage industry.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to know this is the second kind of remarkable decision the Trump administration has done to ease the pain of the shutdown. And the first was what they originally said was that workers were coming in and they were just going to be processing payments to make sure that revenue is coming to the government, but refunds would not go out at tax time, which obviously would result in an enormous amount of pressure on Congress when people start not getting those refunds they're expecting to get in February. So they made a decision that was different from all previous administrations who dealt with shutdowns, which said that actually we're going to bring these workers back in tax filing season and have them push out refunds. And then this comes along where the mortgage industry would like to be processing loans, and because a lot of tax transcripts are required as a way of underwriting the loans, that was stopping, and so that's where that pressure came to bear, and they came up with a new decision. So they're bending rules a lot when it comes to the IRS to change the way it's been dealt with in the past during shutdowns.
So they make these workers not only essential, but they are paying these workers.
Right. They found money to, I guess, make them happier workers, I guess. I don't know.
And how does this benefit the mortgage industry?
It makes sure that they can make loans, that they can make money, that that things don't shut down for them, even if it's shut down for most of the federal government.
And this was done at the behest of Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary.
Well, his people were obviously listening to the lobbyists and made things happen.
So talk about your research looking at the gutting of the IRS, but it doesn't get gutted equally, or at least the effects of it are not equal.
Right. So this starts with the Tea Party Congress coming in after the 2010 midterms, and there's a lot of strong anti-IRS sentiment on the right. And originally, kind of the focus is Obamacare has just been passed, and the IRS plays a crucial role in implementing Obamacare. So it's seen as kind of a way to get at Obamacare, to attack Obamacare by restraining the IRS budget. That leads to the reason for budget cuts. And then there's a large scandal that erupts in 2013 regarding how the IRS is, from the view of people on the right, targeting right-leaning political nonprofits. This is the Lois Lerner scandal. And that leads to the justification for other massive cuts. And so starting in 2011 through 2018, the IRS budget is being really hacked at in some years and just kind of held down in other years. And the cumulative effect of that is a budget cut of over $2 billion in today's dollars over that time. They lost a third of their enforcement staff. And, taxpayer service has suffered, but that has actually been one area where, constituents are angry because they call the IRS, they can't get an answer to questions. And so Republicans have kind of bumped funding a little bit in that area. But there's other basic areas that are in a state where they've never been before.
So some people might say, good, they shouldn't have this kind of resources. There's a whole movement that says, obviously, they want the IRS gutted. And then others who say government is absolutely essential. Who is more likely to get audited?
Well, so I think it's important to note, one of our largest anti-poverty programs is the Earned Income Tax Credit. About $70 billion goes out. It goes to 27 million households, and that is run by the IRS. And since the 90s, the Republicans in particular, have put a lot of pressure on the IRS to audit people who receive that benefit. It comes in the form of a tax refund each year. Over a third of the audits that the IRS does are of people who receive that credit. And that's a type of auditing that the IRS does. It's largely automated. And so what we're able to show in our piece is that audits of the rich, audits of corporations have come down much more quickly than audits of people who are receiving this credit. These are people, households that tend to have income under $20,000 a year. It's a program that lifts about, millions of children out of poverty every year. And the computers can still pump out those audit letters. And so that area of auditing has fallen much less precipitously.
So let me go to a graphic from your article on earned income tax credit recipients. It shows that since 2011, audit rates for the wealthy have dropped more steeply than for the earned income tax credit recipients. For example, for taxpayers earning between $200,000 and $500,000 a year, audit rates dropped by 74%. But for earned income tax credit recipients who have a median annual income under $20,000, audits dropped by just 36%. So you're more likely to be audited if you're making less than $20,000 or $40,000 a year than if you make $1 million?
Right. So it's kind of what the IRS has said as well. We're prioritizing these people at the bottom, and we're prioritizing people at the very tippy top, which is people who earn over $10 million a year. But what that means is that audits of the affluent have plummeted far more, so that there's basically no balance anymore, where you have to get up to $1 million a year before you see the same audit rates as people at the very bottom of the income scale.
And so what has happened to people at the top of the income scale?
Well, they're not getting audited. So that's what happens.
And corporations.
Corporations, the largest corporations in the country used to be audited every year. That's happening less and less. So the Microsofts, the Googles, and all those, they might still be audited, but very large corporations are no longer audited everywhere they used to be.
And what's going to be the effect of the government shutdown overall on people paying taxes this year?
Well, it remains to be seen whether the IRS can somehow make the filing season work in a way that and get people's refunds out on time. Enormous and tens of millions of people rely on these refunds being on time. Right now, they are contemplating bringing workers back after not receiving a paycheck for 5 weeks and coming in to process refunds to make sure that everyone gets their refund on time. That remains to be seen how that's going to work out. That's something that's never been done before.
And what were you most surprised by in this series you did?
Well, I would say that some of the most basic things the IRS is not able to do because of the funding drop-off. Like one area is people who do not file any tax return at all. It's kind of hard for the IRS to find those people and to tell them that you owe this money and to track them down and to make them pay. And so they basically just stop doing it. So if you don't file taxes, so they're not opening those investigations. They're saying, well, we don't have people to do what we need to do, so let's make sure that we're cashing the checks people are sending in. Other things that take more resources to do, that take a lot of time, we just don't have the people to do that, so we're not going to do it.
I want to thank you very much for being with us. Paul Keel, reporter for ProPublica, where he covers business and the economy, contributor to the recent series headlined Gutting the IRS, Who Wins When a Crucial Agency is Defunded? And the subtitle, A Multi-Year Campaign to Slash the IRS Budget Has Left It Understaffed and on the Defensive. That's been good news for tax cheats, the rich, and big corporations, but not for the poor. And that does it for our program. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Geister, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Nadura, Tay-Marie Astudio, and Libby Rainey. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Hugh Grant, David Prude, Ariel Boone. And if you want to go to our website at democracynow.org to watch our video, audio, podcasts, read transcripts, I'm Amy Goodman.